if I heard an instrumental version of that song in a club, I think in my head I'd be like, okay, that's probably some like, maybe some kind of edited Human League cut that I've not heard before. But then, and this is what I probably love most about LCD Soundsystem, you've got Murphy singing on the top, almost like a kind of ace in the sleeve.
Because I think Murphy, you know, when he's writing, recording this stuff, he's not hoping that no one notices where he's borrowing it from. He's not living in fear of like being called out to be a fraud. The borrowing is like a large part of the point. Like, he owns being derivative, like it's in part of the essence of the band.
At the end, there's people literally sobbing and just complete, like the lights have gone up and people just can't move. They're clearly just so kind of wrecked emotionally by the 3-hour show that they've just seen.
Hello, welcome back to Death with the Record. Today we're going to be chatting about LCD Soundsystem's This Is Happening. Now this is the final episode of Season 1, so you know we had to spice things up slightly. So for those of you who are listening to the audio version of this podcast, me and Ollie are actually in the same room today. We are looking at each other.
It's the first time this series.
Yeah, first time this series, we're face to face. So if you haven't seen the video version of this show yet, I urge you, go on YouTube, maybe check it out. If you just stick with the audio version, your prerogative. If you don't know by now, we start this podcast with the year in music. LCD Soundsystem released this album in 2010. Ollie, it's over to you.
Well, yeah, 2010 was a really, really good year, to be honest. I reckon perhaps not on 1997's level when we looked at Stereolabs, Dots and Loops, but I'd definitely say top half of the years that we've covered so far in Season 1.
Sure.
Speaking of Series 1, Gorillaz brought out Plastic Beach, Erykah Badu brought out New America Part 2. 2010 was a massive year for indie music. I'm just going to reel off some of the names of bands that released albums that year. Vampire Weekend, Arcade Fire, The National, Deer Hunter, Tame Impala, Beach House, MGMT, and Ariel Pink. So yeah, that was a serious year. Electronic stuff as well, really good. Massive Attack brought out an album, Fortet 2, and Caribou brought out Swim, which for me anyway, definitely seemed to dramatically accelerate the trajectory of that guy's career, especially in the UK. In terms of hip hop, there's one rapper in particular that released a record that is recognised as a modern classic 10 years on. And I think will probably continue to be viewed as such 100 years from now. Absolutely. Jamie, I think you know what I'm talking about. I'm of course referencing Drake's debut, Thank Me Later.
You had me there.
And aside from that, I don't really think there's much else.
Okay, just say it.
Kanye West
There
brought
we
out
go.
My Beautiful
Very
Dark
good.
Twisted Fantasy.
Yeah.
One thing that I've been thinking about this segment is it often seems like we're both kind of ruling the roost and we were always into this music when it was released.
Yeah, I mean, look at all our records, guys. Yeah.
At least I can't say that's true for me. So with that in mind, one question I want to ask you is, 15-year-old Jamie Cameron in 2010, if he was at a festival, which 2 or 3 artists of those that I've mentioned do you reckon he'd be most excited to see or watch at a festival?
Well, I was 14 at the time.
14.
And funnily enough, we actually have a very accurate historical insight into what 14-year-old Jamie was doing. Because I actually saw a few of the artists that released albums this year, that very year. So I went to Latitude Festival, which was my first major festival. I saw Vampire Weekend just after they'd released Contra. And I remember it being like the best experience I've ever had at a gig and being like blown away. Bearing in mind though, the only people or person or artist I'd really seen beforehand was Enter Shikari. So at that point I was
a bit of a gear change.
Yeah, I was coming out of the end of my metalcore phase, which believe me was intense. But yeah, the other band I saw at that festival was The National. And weirdly enough, I went back and looked at the full bill for Latitude in 2010, and there were some pretty crazy artists lower down the bill than you might have expected. So like Midlake, Dirty Projectors are both above Mumford & Sons on this bill.
That's strange.
The next year, Ed Sheeran's like way down, but in 2010, Richard Hawley, The XX, Grizzly Bear are all fairly low, and then Darwin D's and Everything are like on the 5th stage, which I remember is just like kind of like, you know,
little pokey affair.
Yeah, like big time. So yeah, a bit of a strange one looking back at what it was like at 14 years old.
Well, here's another question for you. So you can speak to 14-year-old Jamie now, today. Which artists are you telling him, yo, you should go check these out?
In forms of what can I guess musically educating my past self.
Exactly, yeah.
I'd say maybe Erykah and Ariel Pink, because I definitely hadn't listened to either of them at that time. I feel like that's the kind of thing, or the kind of artists which you're talking about accelerating Caribou's career. They would accelerate kind of a musical education because I think they're both doing like such like broad things. So probably those two. What about yourself?
I'd definitely go with Erica and probably Caribou, to be fair, because I felt like he was one of the electronic musicians that kind of switched me onto a different thing. So if that could happen 3 years earlier, then who knows? Maybe I'd be a top 100 DJ by now.
Was it not Disclosure, mate? I thought that was your.
That never really got into them. That much, but
fair enough.
Anyway, that was 2010 in music. So yeah, let's move on to This Is Happening.
Yeah,
I think for some of the records that we've covered in Series 1, it can be slightly difficult for me to pinpoint an exact moment when I first heard each album.
Yeah,
because some of them have kind of diffused into my life to such an extent that it's difficult to pinpoint an exact before and after moment.
Yeah.
But that is not the case with LCD Soundsystem for me. I remember for Christmas in 2012, my mum bought me a couple of CDs by them. And by the time I went back to school in January as a fresh-faced 17-year-old, it felt like they'd been my favourite band forever.
Nice.
I think music in general, but particularly rock music, has an interesting relationship with youth. The kind of infinite industry conveyor belt that builds up and burns out precocious talents is evident. If I'd become a lead singer in a successful band rather than taking maths A-level, 3 years on from listening to LCD, I might have released an album, shot to stardom, struggled with fame before going on to crash and burn in a storm of addiction, controversy and deteriorating music. Anyway, for James Murphy, the creative force behind LCD Soundsystem, this narrative could not be any less fitting. He was well into his 30s by the time he'd had his first major success in music, which was, of course, Losing My Edge, released in 2002. Furthermore, the long gap between him leaving NYU and releasing that song is something that he's described as an abject failure. So yeah, a little bit peak. He left university to create music, but found himself becoming increasingly bitter at other scenes, other people's success, and basically says he just frittered his life away. I think an illuminating example is something that happened when he was in his early 20s, and he was, this bright English student. He was in talks with producers of a new sitcom to be their first staff writer, and he was sent scripts and everything, but he was so, intent on pursuing a career in music, he failed to respond. The show itself, it was called Seinfeld. So yeah, 180 episodes.
Brutal.
And 10 years later, he was still going nowhere. But Losing My Edge proved to be this watershed moment that catapulted him to success. And, a debut album followed. Fast forward 5 years to 2010, This Is Happening was released. At the time, slated to be LCD's final record, but more on that later.
Indeed.
Exactly. This Is Happening was different from those first two albums in that recording and production, which was usually split between Massachusetts and New York, was actually completed in Los Angeles. Murphy basically moved himself, the band, his beloved collection of synths across the country to The Mansion, which is basically like a huge house cum studio, formerly owned by Rick Rubin, where artists like the Red Hot Chili's and Jay-Z had previously co-recorded. I think more than any active rock band, with maybe the exception of the Strokes, LCD, in my eyes, are really, really synonymous with New York. So I find it kind of strange that they decided to up sticks for their final record. We've spoken about New York quite a lot in this series and, its status as a melting pot for folk and hip-hop. But I definitely think you can throw punk, disco, house, and many more scenes in there as well.
Yeah, definitely.
As an opening question, what do you think you can hear these varied genres reflected in LCD Soundsystem?
I think absolutely you can hear the influence on the music. I think one of the most interesting things about LCD Soundsystem and James Murphy by extension, as well as what you've already mentioned about the fact that his success completely subverts this usual story of youthful excess, which funnily enough, the Strokes were basically living out at the same time in New York.
In the same town, yeah.
Release 2 good albums, all get addicted to heroin, and then make some pretty dire albums after that fact. But what James Murphy was doing with his influences, I think, is really, really interesting. Just the way that he kind of played with the idea of influence as a concept in itself. So for those of you who haven't heard James Murphy discuss the musicians who have been important in his life, some of the names that usually get mentioned are Brian Eno, Bowie, Suicide, Talking Heads, Lou Reed, Kraftwerk, Can. You get the idea. So for those of you who have listened to those artists I've just named quite extensively and also know LCD Soundsystem's music, you've probably realised there are quite a fair few examples of when James Murphy has literally taken a riff, a drum pattern, a musical idea from an influence of his, and recycled it almost exactly for a new song of his own. So I can give you a few specific examples. So the Losing My Edge riff and how that song progresses is definitely a rip-off of the Killing Joke song Change. Disco Infiltrator takes parts from Kraftwerk's song Home Computer. Movement, the main riff from that, is very similar to Suicide's song Ghost Rider.
Definitely.
And then from this album, This Is Happening, All I Want, 100% the guitar tone is a rip-off of Robert Fripp's kind of famous droney tone as well. Basically, there are loads of examples of it, and there's definitely too many to name. But what I want to make clear is that I'm not trying to do like a kind of, I caught you, James Murphy, like you're stealing. Because I think Murphy, when he's writing, recording this stuff, he's not hoping that no one notices where he's borrowing it from. He's not living in fear of like being called out to be a fraud. The borrowing is like a large part of the point. Like, he owns being derivative, like it's in part of the essence of the band. There's a great quote he says where he said, I've always been a good imitator. I love music, but I'm just not that original. Anyway, it got me thinking about something that Norman Blake said from Teenage Fan Club. And he said that any music that doesn't sound like anything else in rock history always sounds terrible. Which I think is really interesting, and like kind of basically says like, you can try and make something as new, a new and like just completely different to anything else if you want, but that's actually kind of like a fool's errand, because you need that canon influences to draw from. But do you know what I mean by that? Or
yeah, because I think often the line between influence and plagiarism is one that gets kind of blurred and greyed quite a lot. But as you say, I think with LCD Soundsystem, there's at least two things in my mind to consider. Number one, as you say, he's laying all his cards on the table. He's being very upfront. These are the songs I'm taking things from, and it's not my fault if you don't know what it is. He's literally said that.
Yeah.
And the second thing is, compared with a band that we've slagged off quite a lot in the first series, for
I know where you're going with this. Yeah.
People, rinse Oasis for pillaging songs and ideas and stuff,
Which they do. Yeah.
Which they do. But I think the difference is with LCD Soundsystem is James Murphy's doing it really, really well.
Yeah.
And making amazing, amazing pop music and rock music, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah,
so they're the two things.
Well, the other thing is that like, yes, James Murphy's doing it well. Some people argue that Oasis did it well. But I think what's different with James Murphy is that he's adding something of his own. Like, his personality, regardless of what he's ripping off, it comes through so strongly. Like, what Oasis really adding to that kind of classic ingredient that they rip off? Maybe a sense of kind of like laddish bravado, but is that really like doing something new with the music? So I think the most important thing is that James Murphy's doing something new. But just to kind of like return to this idea of influences in the first place, Chuck Klosterman says right, like, that the internet gives people a fluency in history, because these days you can go on YouTube and there is just like innumerable bands, artists from all over the world on there, from all through history, basically from all through the 20th century to now. So there's so much music out there, there's so much stuff to take influence from, there's so many kind of places you can go. The idea of moving things forward and doing something new, it's not really like, hard to do, it's almost like impossible, because there's always going to be something out there that you sound similar to, just because now this kind of capacity for human memory it's like infinite. There's any number of things that can be stored on YouTube. And I think with James Murphy, he's really, really good at making a song sound like it's from the 70s or the 60s or the 80s or whatever. But what sometimes the struggle is, you make music that sounds like the 70s, but how do you get it to feel like it matters like the 70s? Because when like Brian Eno was making music, it really mattered. It was like a scene. And I think that's what Murphy does. He adds something new to it, whether it's his lyrics, his character, a kind of sense of Murphy being cool. I know, I hate to say it, but he does have like a kind of coolness to him.
I think his coolness is a weird one, because I think if you look at him objectively, he's like
a
40
kind of
years old,
balding, kind of chubby, really hairy middle-aged man, isn't he?
And he's kind of like, objectively, you'd say, okay, probably not going to be the front man of like a massive rock band, or probably not going to be the coolest guy on the planet.
Yeah.
But he's kind of made that his edge a little bit, and he's kind of become cool by almost being uncool.
It's a very 21st century idea, isn't it? Like, that he's cool because he's like subverting the idea of cool. But like, I mean, I think maybe that's a good way into talking about the album This Is Happening. Like, these like this Murphy touch, or these like kind of James Murphy moments on each song. So even if it's like a rip-off of something else, he adds that thing. Like, what moments, or Murphy moments to coin a kind of dreadful phrase, do you find yourself drawn to most on this album?
I think, no doubt in my mind, I Can Change.
Mate,
I think
what a song.
What a song.
What a
I mean,
song.
This going back to what you were saying about, influences and whatnot. If I heard an instrumental version of that song in a club, I think in my head I'd be like, okay, that's probably some like maybe some kind of edited Human League cut that I've not heard before. And I'd be quite happy to just listen to an instrumental version of that. But then, and this is what I probably love most about LCD Soundsystem, you've got Murphy singing on the top, almost like a kind of ace in the sleeve that he just like whips out of nowhere. And, you know, his lyrics are at turns funny, at turns heartbreaking. I think he's one of the most poignant lyricists I've ever heard. I think there are so many quotable lyrics in this song, I don't even know where to start. But I'm going to throw one at you. And love is a murderer, but if she calls you tonight, everything is all right. Is that not like the perfect depiction of, no matter how confident you feel, how great you think you are, romance has this way of just completely and utterly leveling you and just reducing you to like an anxious fool. And I just think that lyric in that song is just perfect.
I think the interesting thing about that song as well is it's kind of uncharted territory for him, right? Because it's not like he doesn't ever sing earnest songs, but the earnest songs he sings on previous albums, they're about friendship, like Someone Great or like All My Friends. Whereas this is like a song, like a romantic song about a lover. And there's a great story about how when he recorded the vocals for this song, he kicked all the band out the studio.
Really?
Because he was so embarrassed about, one, like the weightiness of the themes he was taking on, and also he was kind of crippled by this idea of making something cringe. Obviously this idea of cool, he didn't want to make a cringy love song. But like honestly, what he ended up making, I think it's like one of my favourite love songs of all time. It's sincere, but it's so playful, and it's like, bring up another lyric in reply to yours, when he says like love is a curse shoved in a hearse, love is an open book to a verse of your bad poetry, and that's coming from me. It's just like, it's so perfect, isn't it? It's an amazing song.
I think the sincerity, what you're talking about, is one of the most important things for me, because what pisses me off sometimes is when you have like pop or rock stars singing songs with this type of sentiment, but you know, it just doesn't line up. Like say if Drake, for example, was singing this, it would come across as self-effacing, but just in a really, really false
that would be fucking
way.
strange.
Drake covered "I Could Change." But going back to, but I just think because it's Murphy, like he's older, he's grey, he's not like a normal pop star. It kind of comes across as really honest, really sincere, really truthful. And I think more than anything on this album, I just really appreciate like the vulnerability and the tenderness. What other songs jump out to you?
Well, this is kind of going in the complete other direction, but I think Pow Pow has Murphy in his other kind of mode, which is the kind of witty, like didactic mode of, you know, basically each album seems to have at least one song like this. Obviously the classic example is Losing My Edge. But it's basically the song kind of like a self-mocking, painfully self-aware rumination on this idea of constantly trying to see things from every perspective, you know, to step outside your own experience, to occupy the middle ground, and how in the end when you do that, a lot of the time you end up basically saying nothing. At least that's what I get out from that song. But as the lyrics, you know, kind of from this position I can see both of them. From this position I totally get how the decision was reached. I can say serious or cop out or hard to define, or those kind of lyrics. I think that playful mode of Murphy is as enjoyable as the sincere one too. I'm not sure what you think. But.
I think because it's kind of funny, as you say, this and Losing My Edge.
You said I'm losing my edge.
They're obviously presented and sung as kind of stream of consciousness, as if he's kind of coming up with these, you know, from this position, just relax, name dropping random things. And you just know, if you know much about James Murphy as like a musician or a writer, this will be the most kind of thoroughly planned, detailed thing. So I find the juxtaposition of the two kind of funny. I mean, we should probably talk about James Murphy at least very briefly as like a collaborator / someone in the studio, because like over the series we've covered like Stereolab, who was also some really Dilla, or like, you know, like Damon Albarn, all these kind of usually men. Joni Mitchell will be another example of someone who is compulsive and a woman, who just control things in the studio. They are like draconian. It's their way or the fucking highway. And James Murphy definitely has that kind of atmosphere, like attitude for sure. I watched an interview with him last week where he's talking, I think it was on the Red Bull thing, and he's talking about how they rehearse for the live show. And he basically says, I am a nightmare to work with because I will have the band in one day, it's like 10 hours, we will rehearse one song until we have it perfect. And he basically said, this is really easy music to play, but it's really difficult music to play well. And I think that kind of sums his production style up quite nicely, I think.
It definitely does. And like, I'm not sure about you, but I really enjoy James Murphy when he's in that kind of like mood, or when he's like doing Pow Pow, or kind of being because a lot of people find him irritating, right? I know we talked about him being very likable, which to an extent he is, but there are people who find that kind of James Murphy mode very irritating. But anyway, any other songs that you stand out?
I think the final song as well, Home.
Yeah.
I mean, we've spoken in a little bit this series about the importance of track listing, like especially on the Dan Avery episode.
Yeah.
I've got to ask you, do you think in Dance Yourself Clean, which is the opening track, and Home, the closing track, can you think of a better beginning and an end to an album?
No, I mean, as like bookends on either side, obviously the way that they call back to each other with that kind of progression, it's perfectly constructed, isn't it?
Because it reminds me, at least lyrically, it reminds me a little bit of stuff like All My Friends. I think there's a line like, if you're afraid of what you need, look around you, you're surrounded, it won't get any better.
Yeah.
And so good night. And you think, that is, if that was like a mic drop, you've literally, you've killed it.
Well, which we can talk about later, because it kind of almost was. But I mean, the only comparison I can think of in forms of like the scope of a song and like the sheer joy I have when listening to it is something like This Must Be the Place.
Yeah.
Like by Talking Heads, which has a similar idea, like, Home, this is the place. Listening to that and listening to this, knowing what we know about James Murphy and what we talked about with kind of aping his influences, that's 100% kind of, I think, having a dialogue with that song as well.
Definitely.
And with Talking Heads. Favourite track, if you had to pick one then?
I can change. It's tricky.
Yeah, I mean...
What about you?
I think we have to shout out All I Want, which is another one of my favourite songs on this album. So, but I Can Change is just, I think, probably my favourite love song.
Pop song.
One of the most perfect pop songs I've ever heard. Anyway, let's move on to our next category, and that's Apex. So this is the segment where we imagine that LCD's career is laid out before us like a landscape. What we're trying to work out is where the album lies in the context of the band's career. Is it the pinnacle? Is it up on Mount Everest? Is it perhaps a bit of a flop below sea level? Ultimately, is this the band's best album? So, first of all, I will just run through LCD's discography for you. So their self-titled debut came out in 2005, followed up in 2007 by Sound of Silver. Then 2010, of course, This Is Happening. And then 7 years later, the band came back with American Dream. Ollie, I'm going to pass it over to you here. How do you see the various stages of their career, how they progressed, and then ultimately, do you think This Is Happening is their apex? And if not, what is?
I think this is quite an easy conversation. Their apex, for me, is either Sound of Silver or This Is Happening. I wouldn't have too many complaints if somebody went either way with those two.
Yeah.
I think for me, This Is Happening just edges it, but it's probably by a whisker, to be honest. I've got to shout out their debut as well, because I think there's quite a few kind of thrashy post-punk tracks inspired by the likes of Suicide, for example, that you were mentioning earlier. And I really like them, like Movement.
Yeah.
And I feel
which is a rip-off of a Suicide.
a Suicide rip-off. And I feel as though that element of their sound has kind of dissipated and lost a little bit. It
fizzles out slightly towards the end.
Yeah, because there's nothing really like that on This Is Happening, I think.
Yeah, I think you'd be right in saying that.
And what is also funny about the debut is if you listen to that now, and people, please shout me out if you think I'm talking rubbish. It feels like James Murphy did half the vocal takes with a kind of horrendous cold.
You said this to me, and I was like, "What are you on about?" But I listened back, and you're right. There's some songs where he's got like the Q-tip kind of thing going.
It's like
on,
if you sing Disco Infiltrator like this, it's kind of how I feel that's how he sounds.
Yeah. Probably not wrong.
I've got to ask. You mentioned it there, American Dream. I know we're going to speak a little bit about the breakup in the next segment. What's your take on that album? Where do you kind of view that?
I mean, I definitely don't think it's a disgrace because that was obviously the anxiety surrounding that album, right? But for some reason, it just definitely also doesn't hit the same to me in forms of like how it makes me feel. Like I kind of see LCD Soundsystem's music as fitting so perfectly into the noughties as a decade, and the way that obviously it came out in 2010, and then Losing My Edge was coming up earlier in the decade. Maybe that's part of what's not gelling for me when I listen to it, but it feels like kind of like. And I can't believe I'm about to bring this up, and Ollie's gonna hate me, but like when American football reformed, and the album's right there. For people who aren't seeing this on video, the American football vinyl is in the background, of course. When they reformed, as much as those two albums they've released since they reformed are like decent, and like they're not bad albums by any means. They're not badly written. They're not badly made. It just doesn't feel the same. It doesn't feel the same. So I mean that's how I feel. But as you've already alluded to, the next segment is alternate cuts, and we were going to discuss a bit about that. So should we just move on?
Yeah, let's go for it.
Okay, great. This segment is alternate cuts. So this is the segment where we engage with the major criticisms that surround the artist and then consider how they might affect our enjoyment of the record. Now this week I wanted to delve into something very specific, and that is James Murphy's decision to break up LCD Soundsystem at their peak, how that led into the farewell show at Madison Square Garden, and then of course their eventual decision to come back and reform the band for a new album a few years later. Crucially, I wanted to try and come at it from a historical angle and see what exactly James Murphy, the other members of LCD and the press actually said about it at the time. Because I don't know about you, Ollie, but I feel like so much gets said about LCD's split, what the MSG gig was all about, whether Murphy was motivated by money or something cynical.
It becomes a bit of a quagmire at the end. It's impossible to work anything out.
Absolutely. So today I thought, let's take it back to 2009, and then afterwards we can analyse what we actually think about it all. So, to begin, I think it's worth remembering just how tenuous the whole idea of LCD Soundsystem as a band was in the first place. James Murphy said frequently that he didn't think, or doesn't think of LCD as a real band at all. They were his studio project that he would release via Death From Above, and then LCD would come together to cover that album live. I mean, there's a quote where he talks about them being the world's best cover band, right? Now anyway, before even the announcement of this is happening had come out, there were murmurs that Sound of Silver might be their last record. Like NME published an article in November 2008 to that effect. But then later in 2009, Murphy confirmed that This Is Happening was going to be released. And then once again, rumours start to emerge that this third record would be their last one. And if I'm honest, Murphy definitely encouraged this idea from the start. He did an interview with Rolling Stone where he said, I feel like this should be the last record. A lot of people make 3 good records and then they don't make good records anymore. If we get any bigger than we are, I would lose some interest. I feel like I made a band that was about how I felt about music, as an argument. I feel like I've explained myself and it's time to do something else. So Murphy in interview frequently made reference to bands like U2, The Cure, Talking Heads, R.E.M., who he thinks all made too many albums or like seemed to drastically decrease in quality after their third record. But I just want to make this clear. All of this dialogue and the conversation was taking place long before the MSG show happened. But since the plans for breaking up had already been laid, when it came to booking Madison Square Garden, kind of the most iconic of New York venues, this is the home of the New York Knicks, the home of boxing, the Mecca, James Murphy was basically frustrated by the show promoters' lack of faith that he'd be able to actually fill it out. They even suggested that Big Boy open for them, which is just the most bizarre thing ever.
It's a bit of a clash, that.
Yeah, I don't know who came up with that. But basically, Murphy says he officially pulled the trigger on breaking up the band as a result of a phone conversation. So there's a quote where he talks to Vulture and he says, behind that idea was the promoter's belief that we just weren't going to sell any tickets unless there was some extra element. So I got mad on the phone. I was like, well, how about it's our last fucking show? And I hung up the phone. Then I was like, I guess that'll be our last show then. Regardless, when it came to this Madison Square Garden gig, all of the indie world, all of the LCD fans were under the impression that this would be their last ever show. And obviously what a show it was. I urge everyone to go and watch the Shut Up and Play the Hits documentary. I think at least it captures kind of the euphoria, but then also the pathos of a band's final moments really well. It's actually quite emotional watching
some of the facial expressions of people in the crowd.
Like Donald Glover who pops up.
Donald Glover, he looks like he's having a fun time.
Yeah, he did.
But by the end, there's people literally sobbing and just complete, like the lights have gone up and people just can't move. They're clearly just so kind of wrecked emotionally by the 3-hour show that they've just seen.
The thing that I always think of, it feels a bit like an elegy. It's like an elegy to the band. Which is what makes what happens next so interesting. I'm going to pass this over to you now, Ollie.
Yeah. So it's the big question, isn't it? If you've been in, one of the most successful rock bands of the decade, once that has ended, kind of where the heck do you go?
Yeah.
For James Murphy, it turned out there were quite a few avenues of exploration. So he opened a bar and a cafe in New York because he's a bit of a foodie, I guess would be an appropriate word. Launched his own coffee line called House of Good. He's acted and directed films. Obviously continued his own production career because he had production on the Arcade Fire album.
Yeah.
I think more interesting was he was involved in a project called Subway Symphony, which basically involved him trying to lobby to change the soundtrack of New York's subway system, which, Google that. It's fairly interesting. Another passion project, along with Too Many DJs, who are a DJ duo from Belgium, he designed a unique 50,000 watt vinyl only sound system called Despacio, and this is kind of toured around America and Europe, and the size makes it an absolute logistical nightmare. Apparently they just lose money every time they try and move it somewhere. It was actually meant to be making a reappearance at London's Roundhouse this year, before COVID hit, obviously. You know, if you're not missing clubs and sound systems, have a look on YouTube at some of the footage of that, because I guarantee you will be by the end. But whilst all these other projects were going on, Murphy found himself in a position where he had more songs than he knew what to do with. And it must have been incredibly confusing, because it's like, okay, do you launch a solo career and bring out a solo record, just James Murphy? Do you bring out an album but have to steer clear of musicians that you've worked with previously because you don't want it to be LCD Soundsystem? Do you reform LCD Soundsystem?
Or do you just keep all the songs to yourself? Right?
Yeah, and go crazy probably. In the end, guidance came from quite an unlikely but quite an experienced source. Murphy was invited to collaborate by David Bowie on his final record, Black Star. And it was during this time that he sought some advice. And Bowie basically asked Murphy, does reforming the band make you uncomfortable? And Murphy said, yeah. Bowie said, good. It's a good thing you'll be uncomfortable.
That's interesting.
Because it'll make you work harder. And, you know, as strange as it was that this was David Bowie talking to James Murphy, you know, in Murphy's words, this guy seemed more like a god than a human being. This council kind of swung things. And basically, there was a comeback gig announced at Coachella 2016, I think. And then the band went on a world tour the year after to basically promote American Dream, which we talked about earlier. But yeah, this certainly wasn't positive news for everybody. Like, it wasn't well received in all quarters. Some fans felt angered and betrayed by the news, with many arguing that it cheapened the Madison Square Garden show. This, like, you know, the
spectacle of that.
The spectacle of that. You know, the amount of money that tickets were exchanging for was absolutely bonkers. But yeah, people kind of felt taken advantage of, and they viewed the band with this like mercenary mindset, you know, announce you're disbanding to like sell the tickets. And then reform 5 years later at Coachella of all places. So yeah, that's quite a long odyssey that we've just tried to run through. Having charted their story from then to now after the Reformation, where do you stand with everything, Jamie?
Well, first of all, I think the money thing, this idea that they're mercenary, or they like sold out, or they you know, disbanded the band just to sell out Madison Square Garden for the money. Like, I think that's just like patently false. Like, it's not a valid criticism. So it turns out they didn't make any money off that show. Like, Al Doyle, who's the guitarist in LCD, also in Hot Chip, he put out some tweets where he basically explains that the show, to quote here, lost a lot of money. If you bought a ticket for $1,000 and then arrived by helicopter, you might still have made more money than we did that night. So that's how he puts it in perspective. The thing that upsets me slightly is just how they seem to have undercut, or Murphy seems to have undercut, what could have been just the most perfect of endings. A trilogy of albums, each one better than the last, ending on the track Home. You can't really get much better than that, can you? And then, you know, as Murphy points out as well in interviews, almost zero bands quit while they're ahead. Unless like someone dies or the band splits acrimoniously. It's just so hard to do. And that Madison Square Garden gig has a decade of indie music that couldn't probably be better surmised by that set of songs. And that to me would have been one of the most perfect endings to any band I can think of. And to kind of like throw that away, to undercut that, to make American Dream, that's why I'm kind of like, it kind of grates me slightly.
The thing is, I get what you're saying. I understand how that can vex, because I know exactly what you mean, and that if it had just been Coachella, that would have rankled with me big time, because it would just be...
That would have been disgusting.
It would have been horrendous. But, you know, the fact that they toured around the world, they brought out a new album that Murphy clearly really, really believed in, I'm kind of like, okay, there's more to it here than just, you know, it's not just about money. As you say, it is patently false. What I would say is, when I heard that American Dream was coming out, I remember being filled with a kind of crippling terror. And I'm not exaggerating.
Yeah, I was dreading it as well.
I remember thinking, this is going to ruin their reputation, it's going to ruin their legacy. Don't get me wrong, it's not a bad album. It's nowhere near as good in my eyes as Sound of Silver and This Is Happening, but it certainly doesn't like tarnish their reputation.
It's not a disgrace, is it, by any means?
But what I think is, okay, maybe that has slightly, tarnished this perfect ending that they had because it wasn't on that level. But I think if they continue to make music and could hopefully get back to the level of Sound of Silver or This Is Happening or even their debut, then could you not make an argument that it's been somewhat been worth it?
Well, I mean, I guess the thing I'd say to that is then, like, if that was the case, why not just go on hiatus? And I think the reason they didn't is because it's just like, it's indicative of James Murphy's personality, and we love him, so I feel like I'm allowed to kind of speak slightly negatively about certain aspects of his personality. Obviously, he's defined by like overthinking things. He is that guy. He overthinks everything. He's so preoccupied with his image, how he's going to be perceived, how every little action of this band and every little lyric is going to be taken, and he's so desperate to explain himself and make sure people understand what he's trying to say. I mean, after he reformed the band and people and his fans were angry that he cheapened the Madison Square Garden farewell, which is something he didn't consider. He's quoted as saying, like, for the rest of my life, no matter what happens in this band, we will never break up again. One day we'll stop making music, but no one is going to say a fucking word about it ahead of time. He realises, I think, deep down, James Murphy realises that he didn't handle the situation perhaps as well as he could have. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, I guess, as far as I see it, there's almost a perfect way of summing this up, having just mentioned this aspect of James Murphy's personality, which is from a quote again from Chuck Klosterman. Speaking about James Murphy, he says, "The idea of putting this much effort and thought into the alleged conclusion of your band does sort of illustrate a key characteristic of New York music from that period, which was hyper self-awareness. Everything was considered, and he, James Murphy, was the most considered of that." I think that sums it up pretty well.
Pretty perfectly. With that, should we move on to album cover Nightclub?
Let's do it, yeah.
Perfect, man. So yeah, as always, we're going to end the show, but not just the show, the series.
Oh, shit, yeah, this is our own little version of home, isn't it?
Yeah. With the album cover Nightclub. Now, this basically imagines a scenario where This Is Happening is trying to get into a nightclub, but Jamie and I are the bouncers. But we're not, looking at James Murphy's tie or, maybe he's spouting some nice poetry or whatever in the queue. We're shut up.
Or he's wired off his nut.
Oh, yeah, or he's wired off his nut. We're judging the album off 4 different criteria: aesthetics, originality, harmony between music and artwork, and whether or not you could consider the cover to be iconic. As with any doorman, worth our salt, there's a few different levels to our club. Highest is GOAT, greatest of all time. Incredible album cover. We actually gave one to Joni Mitchell a couple of seasons ago, so a couple of episodes ago, so she's the only one in there at the minute. Then we've got VIP, so not quite on GOAT level, but they'll have their own club, have their own table, sorry. Third is ticket on the door, so just about sneaking in, but you're close to being sent home. Fourth, name not down, you're not coming in. Shocking effort, get lost. So for This Is Happening, the photo was actually taken by a guy called Reuven Wijasuriya. And he's been a bit of a constant collaborator with James Murphy and his record label DFA over the years. And he was actually invited out to the mansion
in LA.
All the way in LA to take some press shots and, quote, bring my weirdness. I mean, I've only seen a bit of footage from the mansion, but he probably found plenty of weirdness there already, I would imagine.
It's kind of like got Midsommar vibes, isn't it?
Yeah. So, to prepare for these press shots, there's like footage of Murphy like getting dressed up in a suit and a tie and basically walking around Hollywood Hills barefoot with a glass of red wine and like these weird sunglasses on.
Of course.
So, yeah, as you do. Anyway, the photo, it kind of channels Robert Longo's Men in Cities, which is a series of graphite and charcoal drawings of smartly dressed men and women in like contorted, strange poses. And the other 70s reference as well is Bowie's Lodger cover. And according to Reuven, these kind of references were less deliberate and more just kind of unavoidable for the kind of thing that Murphy and he wanted to try and accomplish.
Yeah.
Despite taking the press shots at the mansion, the This Is Happening cover was actually taken in Reuven's studio back in New York. So there is still a little bit... That's kind of appropriate, yeah. There is still a little bit of New York peppered on the album. And I think because the final photo was taken in the studio, it's a little bit cleaner, it's a little less experimental, let's say, than some of the shots in LA when they'd sunk a few beers. And Reuven has also referenced how it's more referential to the album as a whole, as well as Murphy's state of being after having just completed the recordings. So he said, you see, James is a bit turned around, not knowing which side is up, yet still confident and moving forward.
Nice.
Jamie, how are you feeling? Are you feeling confident about This Is Happening getting into our nightclub?
I mean, it would be a pretty cruel irony if LCD Soundsystem, of all the artists we've covered this series, didn't get into the album cover nightclub at any level, given what LCD Soundsystem represent. So, yes, I think it's definitely getting in. The question is obviously what tier. I think it's fair to say that this album isn't GOAT. So, for me, it's between In on the Door and VIP. I love the portrait of James. I think it's interesting that this is the album he chose to put himself on the cover for, which I think is interesting. And that makes the sense to me somehow in forms of the progression of their albums. That said, I think I'm going In on the Door, but very much welcomed in. Kind of like there aren't any questions asked. It's not kind of like looking over your ticket, looking at the ID.
Oh, you're a bit old, mate. Get lost.
Yeah, what are we saying here? It's, ticket, come on in, have a good time, get yourself in there. That's how I see it. What do you think?
So, I think their debut is easily their best cover. If we were looking at that, I think that would be VIP.
It's the iconic disco ball, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think if you had to condense into a single photo what LCD Soundsystem means to me, I think that cover pretty much nails it, as well as being pretty iconic. I'm kind of like you. I don't mind this is happening. I like the harmony between the music and the artwork, as you say, and obviously with having James on the front. And it is kind of iconic because of what it's come to represent, this final album that never was.
Yeah, true.
But yeah, I'm not that fussed about the photo itself. I think in the name of, finishing the series, want to finish on a high,
yeah.
Let's say In on the Door.
Well, you were considering kind of like names up, down, not coming in. I think that would be way too harsh.
That would be too harsh. But I think In on the Door is probably fair for this album cover.
I would agree. We'll have to post later on the socials this week all the different albums we've done and where they fit in the club, so we have an idea of who's populating the various tiers. But as it stands, I think Joni Mitchell's Blue is the only GOAT album cover we've done this series, which I think is a nice kind of ratio because we don't want any old, like riffraff getting into the GOAT tier. Anyway, is that the end of this episode?
That is the end of the episode, end of the series.
End of the series, end of series 1. Seeing as this is the conclusion, I feel like now would be a good time to plead even more intensely than I usually do to please follow us on Instagram at Death with the Record, on Twitter as well. If you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe. Feel free to comment, slagging off either me and Ollie for our opinions. We do get some interesting comments over the course of an episode. And if you're listening on Spotify, Apple Pods, wherever you get your podcasts, please follow and rate the podcast 5 stars. That's the end of season 1, Ollie. Let's go.
Big up. Alright, should we stop?